Welcome to Supply Chain Now, the voice of global supply chain. Supply Chain Now focuses on the best in the business for our worldwide audience, the people, the technologies, the best practices, and today's critical issues, the challenges and opportunities. Stay tuned to hear from those making global business happen right here on Supply Chain Now.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Scott Luton here with you on Supply Chain Now. Big show here today. We're diving into the state of freight. In just a moment, we've got an outstanding panel joining me. We're going to be diving into key learnings from the freight markets in 2024. We're going to talk a lot more about the current trends and some of what to expect in freight in 2025. All that and a whole bunch more. So stay tuned for an outstanding conversation filled with, actionable takeaways. I want to get to work and welcome in two esteemed guests here today, starting with Logistics Lee Klaskow, Senior Analyst for Transportation and Logistics at Bloomberg Intelligence and host of the popular podcast Talking Transports. And better yet, we've got Brian Oxley, co-founder and managing director of Vector Global Logistics. Let's bring in Lee and Brian. Hey, Lee, how you doing? Great to have you back.
It's good to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me. And I just have a question. During the transition, you said better yet, and then you said Brian. So I guess Brian's better than me. Is that? Wow. Let's start on a positive note there.
So what I meant to say, you're like Mike Tyson's famous uppercut, knockout punch, right? But Brian keeps him honest with his jab. So it's like a 1-2 punch, right?
Okay.
If that makes sense. Mike Tyson, the modern day 21st century philosopher. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the nose, right? Brian, how are you doing today?
All is good. Good morning.
Great to see you. Great to see you. And Lee, as we were talking pre-show, Lee, we've been fortunate to have you on the show with us in person at events, and then a lot of times remotely. You're rocketing up into like the top 10 of all-time appearances. We appreciate that, Lee. And on the other hand, while I've been in Brian's orbit for years, and you should have been joining us prior to today, Brian, this is your first time here on Supply Chain Now, so welcome in.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming, that's for sure.
It sure has. Well, I've got a fun warm-up question to you both, Brian and Lee. Y'all know I like marking important dates where there'll be parades around the globe. And where I want to start is it's National Beer Can Day across the globe. There'll be parades and parties, you name it. I was trying to find a count of how many cans in a given year, but my calculator didn't go up that high. So it made its debut, though, at a New Jersey-based brewery called Kruger's way back in 1935. So to that end, to celebrate beer cans' important role in powering global supply chain success everywhere, I want to ask both of y'all, your favorite beer that you can get in a can. I'm going to show you mine. I'm already showing you mine. Tecate. The last time I had Tecate, it was in a different brand. So we got a brand spanking new look and feel, but this is delicious beer from Mexico. And if you haven't had it yet, you're missing out. So with that, as I'm kind of setting the standard, Lee, what's one of your favorite beers that can be found in a can?
Well, I hope the Can Association is not sponsoring this episode because I can probably count on one hand how many cans of beer I have in a year. More of a wine and cocktails kind of guy. But when I do drink beer in a can, it's usually very watery beer like a Bud Light at a ball game or something like that. That's usually my go-to beer. The lighter and watery, the better.
Lee, I've always thought we might be second or third cousins, and your response there proves it again. I hadn't had a whole bunch of canned beer in the last year myself. But hey, at the ball game with a hot dog, even if it costs you $50, it still tastes pretty good. Brian, same question. What's your go-to for canned beer?
Along the same lines as Lee, Coors Light, primarily because it was the first beer I had with my father. And it's one of my favorite places in the world is Telluride, and the peak on the can is Wilson Peak. So it's easy drinking and delicious. So,
ooh, easy drinking and delicious. That can be a dangerous combination, much like Brian and Lee here today. But I want to start with this as we get into the reason we're all here. Context, right? The world is moving faster. Gosh, the velocity of global business, I don't think it's ever been speeding up as much as it does these days. We don't get enough context as we should. But Lee, to that end, if you could, for anyone that has missed your, I don't know, 36 appearances with us prior, tell us briefly about yourself and Bloomberg Intelligence.
Sure. So again, my name is Lee Klaskow. I'm a Sagittarius. I work for Bloomberg Intelligence. It's Bloomberg's research arm. We have over 500 analysts and strategists around the globe. The majority of my research goes across the Bloomberg terminal, which for those that, watch movies about Wall Street or see the news, it's that black screen with orange letters like we have here flashing. That's the Bloomberg terminal. I cover all modes of transportation for Bloomberg Intelligence, so ocean, air, trucking, rail, and I cover about 20 individual names. And our research is available on the Bloomberg terminal. And as you mentioned, Scott, I do host a podcast called Bloomberg's Talking Transport, and I do a newsletter. And if anyone's interested in getting on the distribution list, which is free, just reach out to me on LinkedIn.
And I'm going to tell y'all, excellent podcast, Talking Transport. You can get it wherever. Lee's Lowdown, folks, you got to check that out. You can reach out to us. We'll make sure we get the connection and you get on that distribution list. It's great information released every Friday morning, right, Lee?
Yep, Friday. Okay. I like to be in the morning, but sometimes, things get away from me.
Hey, strategic flexibility. We're big fans of that too. All right, Brian, now that we've got a good sense of who Lee is, right? Same thing. Tell us more about yourself as well as Vector Global Logistics.
I took more of the scenic route to get to the logistics realm. Or I know Lee has been in the research side and with Bloomberg for quite some time. For me, I started out backing up, born and raised in Nebraska, went to the University of Nebraska, studied biology and biochemistry, worked for a biotech startup doing drug discovery and patent protection, knew that I wanted to get a graduate degree, but wasn't sure if I wanted to move to a PhD in science or a master's in business, but I didn't have enough information to assess the latter. Went into consulting with Accenture for a few years, found out that the business side is where I wanted to go, left and went to the Kellogg School of Management, spent 2 years there, and then joined the Boston Consulting Group after that. And so spent 4 years there, just doing some very interesting work, but knew I had that entrepreneurial itch. And so after 4 years with BCG, left and started Vector Global Logistics, and that was 16 years ago. And Vector Global is a multinational freight forwarding company. We're currently in 9 countries, and we are the host of Logistics with Purpose, so our side podcast that we do.
That's right. Logistics with Purpose, which you can find right here as part of the Supply Chain Now ecosystem. The last episode, which we've got here, Brian, focused on a really intriguing panel session focused on Valencia and, of course, how they continue to recover from those devastating floods. And you got to check that out wherever you get your podcasts. And also, as you know, we like to do, we try to make it really easy. We've got the link right here to that last episode, and check that out and be sure to subscribe to both of these podcasts we're talking about. Okay, Brian and Lee, we got a lot to get into. And I like both of y'all have a similar sense of humor, so it's gonna be a lot of fun. Before we put on shades or cry into our beer and look into the future, depends on your take, I want to look at the past, right? And talk about what the state of freight was for 2024 and some of our biggest lessons learned there. Lee, I'm gonna go to you first. A couple of my end, freight theft is way up, and I think we need to talk a lot more about that as an industry. And it's incredible to me and surprising how long the Red Sea attacks have gone. I think we had 2 incidents in December, and I was reading here recently that the U.S. is looking more at going after the supply chain that's fueling and enabling those attacks. But those are a couple on my end. When you look back at 2024, what are some of your key takeaways from the state of freight?
We had a lot of major things happening last year, whether it's the collapse of the Baltimore Bridge, whether, to your point with the crisis in the Red Sea, and not to mention a lot of severe weather events that impacted supply chains. I think when we look back at 2024, one word that I would probably use to describe most of the modes that I cover, at least here domestically in the United States, is disappointing. And that is really because the volume really wasn't great. and the pricing was worse. The freight markets have been in a recession for 2.5 years, call it, and it seems like we're finally clawing our way out of that freight recession. The spot market is a little more encouraging right now, and I guess we'll talk about that later. So there are some green shoots, if you will, that things are getting better. And from an international side, I would say, the way I look at it, because we're looking at it from a company perspective, it's been inflated, and a lot of that inflation in revenue has been driven by, what the Red Sea has done to capacity. And that is something that is not sustainable in our view, and should really change things for shipping companies like the Maersks or the Costcos of the world.
Yep. A lot of stuff there. I like something you said halfway through your response there, those green shoots. I'm looking for as many green shoots as we can, as I hope that 2025 is a much better year across much of the freight world. Good stuff there, Lee. All right, Brian, same question. You look back at 2024, what's some of your key takeaways from the state of freight?
Yeah, very interesting year, right? And to echo what Lee had mentioned, focusing more on the international side. For us, you had the Red Sea conflict that kicked everything off, that took out roughly 6 to 8% of the global capacity, with the additional transit time of not being able to go through the Red Sea and having to go down around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to get ships over to Europe and the US East Coast and then back again. But, that kicked off a lot of decrease of capacity coming out. Then moving forward in the year, you had Biden's administration announced a list of tariffs that were going to go into effect. The announcement was made in May, but the target date was not announced until the August timeframe for the first tranche to go into effect in September, and then tranche 2 in the 1st of January of 2025, and then tranche 3 of 26. But what that led to, with the uncertainty as to when that target was going to be hit for the effective date, created a lot of importers to focus on front loading their freight to get freight landed into the US before that increase in tariff took effect. So bringing out capacity, pushing in demand, created a spike in the freight rates, right? And a lot of capacity issues. So you have that coupled with a lot of labor issues, anything ranging from the ILA and the USMX across the East Coast and Gulf, with their short strike that they had in the fall. But we also had strikes in the West Coast of Canada and Vancouver and Prince Rupert. You had the strikes on the rail in Canada. It created a lot of havoc, and it forced a lot of our customers and a lot of people we work with and importers in general to be very nimble when it comes to how to direct freight. How do you want to bring freight into the U.S. to avoid those issues? So,
yep. Yeah, that strike up in Canada, impacting Canada Post, I'll tell you, that went on and on and on. Very disappointing. And one of the big part, actually, that's the theme that Lee said from last year, and it certainly fit that theme, impacted tons of businesses, especially the small and medium businesses that depend on certain carriers. Okay, so again, labor, that kind of the age of labor and labor deals, we've seen a bunch of them. And I'm, for one, thankful that while it's still being ratified by both sides, that the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, y'all know we love our acronyms here, and the United States Maritime Alliance, the USMX, have tentatively agreed to a new 6-year master contract. And thank heavens we have avoided, for the time being at least, right, my jinxing thing, a very costly and damaging work stoppage. Lee, just react a bit to, at least on the surface, a deal that we were all probably hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, they reached a deal. You knew a deal was going to happen. The workers are getting a good pay increase, and they rightfully deserve it. The big sticking point has and always will be automation, because, in some people's mind, automation reduces jobs. It can, but it also can shift jobs, change what those jobs are. Change is hard for anybody, and I understand, the labor's point of view, but I also understand the port's point of view, where they want to be able to improve their throughput of their facilities, and improve the efficiency of their ports to be more competitive with the ports that they're competing with, whether it's ports locally that they're competing with, regionally, or even nationally. Because some shippers really don't care one way or another, if it comes from the east or the west, it really depends on, service levels and costs. So that's of, great importance to the ports. We saw the West Coast ports get a lot of share because of, the concerns over a possible strike. That was probably good, obviously, for those Southern California ports, and good for railroads like Burlington Northern and Union Pacific, bad for the truckers on the East Coast. But that, could all, probably some of that share is going to be shifting back over time.
A lot of good stuff there, and I can't wait till it gets ratified and we can see more details of the agreement itself. But to your point, it's been a few years since I visited the ports. My last one was looking at the port down in Savannah and took a tour. It's fascinating. In 2025, I'm visiting European ports and other domestic ports, and I cannot wait to get my eyes and ears back on what goes on in those amazing seaports. So good stuff there, Lee. Brian, same thing. Respond to the tentative agreement we've got here between the ILA and the USMX.
Yeah, so we knew an agreement was coming. It was just a matter of when, right? And hopefully it wouldn't create as much disruption as what people had thought. We proactively were routing freight away from the East Coast and the Gulf just in preparation of that, because we had the issues on the West Coast 8 years ago, right? When freight was held up for a month before it was able to get to the API points in the US. But it's a good agreement. I think that, to Lee's point, everybody is inherently adverse to change, right? When it comes to the automation piece, obviously that was a sticking point for this second go around. But you look at, what the ports do in Europe, from an automated perspective, it's fascinating when you go and visit the ports, because it's, the guys that are running the gantry cranes are not sitting on the crane. They're sitting in an office 10 miles down the road with a joystick, right? And you have trucks that are automatically coming in with driverless trucks where they're setting containers on it, taking it to the stacks. It's completely automated to pull the containers off the chassis and put them away, right? I can understand the ILA's position of wanting to move away from automation, but if we can push those jobs to do in different areas but still keep the labor, it's a win-win for all. So
yep. And we'll see. Early reports are the ILA really won the automation battle. From what I've been reading from folks that have had a glimpse of the agreement, they've reportedly allowed for some automation, but they are able to really rubber stamp exactly what makes it all the way into the port. So we'll see how that plays out. All right, so we're shifting over, Lee and Brian. We want to get a look ahead at the path forward, looking at current trends, new trends, evolving trends, and maybe even some prognostications of how all of that will impact the state of freight here in 2025. It's hard to believe, Lee and Brian, we're just a couple weeks away from the Super Bowl, and it seems like we were just getting through the holidays, right? So really quick, bold, fearless prediction before we get into freight. Lee, we got Washington, Philadelphia, Kansas City, and Buffalo. Who's your Super Bowl winner?
I'd like to see the Commanders and the Bills in the Super Bowl, and the Bills winning.
Okay.
I'm a Giants fan, so I don't have a dog in this hunt, but I dislike Philly more than Washington. So
oh boy,
that.
Okay. Lee's projecting Buffalo and Washington, pulling for the Commanders. Brian, how about you? Who you predicting?
It's not the popular vote, but the Chiefs. Growing up in Nebraska, we did not have a professional football team, so you either gravitated towards the Broncos or the Chiefs. And I lived in Kansas City for a few years and went to most of the games while I was living there, so I have to root for the Chiefs. But I know it's the unpopular vote.
Well, only because they've been so dominant. I love the Chiefs growing up. And of course, my dear friend Greg White, massive Chiefs fan forever. And for so long, they couldn't get over the hump. So, they've just been so dominant. So we'll see. We'll see who plays out. I kind of like Lee. I kind of like that Washington Commander story with the rookie quarterback. That's pretty cool. All right, back to freight. Let's start with air freight. And Lee, I'm going to start with you first here. We've gotten past the holidays and we're, volumes now take a dip. We're in the new year. We're starting to see some air freight prices starting to trend down for a few weeks. What do you look at in the air freight space in terms of trends and what we might see here for the rest of the year?
Yeah, so it's really, China is going to be obviously a big driver. There's been a huge amount of freight coming out of China, especially given some of the e-commerce, the cheaper e-commerce players like Shein and Temu, there's been a lot of exports out of that, and that's been like driving a lot of the volume and probably some of the good pricing. At the end of the day, capacity is at a good spot right now. You have these major networks like the FedExes and the UPSs kind of restructuring their networks to deal with the new normal of their businesses, which is really more B2C business versus B2B business. And so, I think pricing could hold here in 2025. But the demand side is really going to be driven about how good China can be at stimulating their economy, which has seemed to have stalled as of late.
Yep. A lot of moving pieces there, Lee. Good stuff. Brian, same question. Air freight, what are you seeing?
Yeah, for us, it's going to be a lot of demand in the first part of the year, right? So people are air freighting out for two reasons, right? One, it's going to be to make sure that they can get product where they need it to quickly, and two, it's if there's a price implication, which would be the tariffs. So we're seeing a lot of demand when it comes to importing from an air freight standpoint into the U.S. to beat the tariffs, and we'll talk about that from the ocean standpoint as well. But
Yep.
people want to land the product here so they can avoid the potential tariff increase if and when that actually happens. So,
yep. All right, let's talk ocean freight. Container prices are trending down. I learned that via checking out the Logistics Lee lowdown this week. And of course, you got Lunar New Year at the end of this month, fast approaching. We got a lot of shutdowns, of course, every year. Lee, when it comes to ocean freight, what are you seeing?
I agree that we've seen a lot of pull forward demand, and that's really been impacting volumes, and it's also been a net positive for pricing. I think looking forward, it's going to open up very tough comparisons. We expect rates to continue to decline to probably where pre-Red Sea levels and pre-Red Sea crisis levels. And that's really just driven by the fact that there's a lot of new capacity that's expected to come onto the water. And if we just look at that and view where demand is going to be, which, kind of look at global GDP expectations, supply is expected to outpace demand, which will, weigh heavily on rates, coupled with the fact of tougher comparisons because of the volume stuff that we spoke about, should put a lot of pressure on rates in 2025.
Brian, same question. And I love new capacity coming online, more options. We'll see how that factors into the global rates there. Brian, what are you seeing when it comes to ocean freight?
well, first off, we're off to a good year, right? Or I guess good news, anyways, when it comes to the ILA USMX agreement, and then also with the ceasefire over in the Red Sea with Hamas and Israel. We do have a lot of freight capacity coming online, which is great. I think in 2024, there were roughly 2.8 million TEUs that came online, and another 1.8, 1.9 million TEUs are planned to come online in 2025. So that'll put a lot of downward pressure on pricing. When it comes to opening up the Red Sea, that's going to help out a lot because it's going to take the artificial pull away from capacity to put back in the system now that you're able to not have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. It's going to cause a lot of chaos in the beginning, given that you have freight that's already on vessels that are moving down around the tip of South Africa. And once the Red Sea opens, then you'll have the freight that'll be moving through the Red Sea. So you'll have a bunch of vessels that'll be arriving into Europe about the same time. So we can expect a lot of port congestion when that does happen. So it's not going to be a soft landing when that happens, but we do think that come 6 months from now, everything should balance out that pre-Red Sea market as we had seen in 2023. It is going to be an interesting year with that. And I don't expect any vessels to start moving through the Red Sea in the next few months. If you look at the position of the carriers, they have a certain set of criteria of what they need before they're going to allow their vessels to go through. And it makes sense. But it'll be something we can all prepare for.
I would just add that, one of the metrics that we look at on the terminal is the WCI index, and that was around 6,000 back in July of 2024. It's around 3,500 now, so it's down significantly. But just also, while it's down significantly, before the Red Sea crisis, that index was anywhere between, call it like around 1,500, 1,800. So, there is a lot more downside for rates, assuming that, once the Suez Canal is safe to traverse, and obviously that's a big if and when. But I guess fingers crossed. It looks like we're slowly heading in that direction, which is a positive, for shippers because their costs will come down considerably due to the deflationary impact of lower rates.
Yep. I'll tell you, as I shared a few minutes back, I'm surprised it's gone on this long. Safety first, but one of the phrases that was shared with me from a DP World executive in recent weeks was trade will always prevail. There's a lot of truth to that, and the power of trade helping us to innovate and overcome problems and disruptions and lead to new things. But we got to provide for safe travel through one of the most important supply chain routes that powers that global trade. So we'll see what's in the weeks and months ahead. All right, so we've done air freight. We've talked about ocean freight. Let's talk about railroads, which is probably one of the least understood aspects or modes of freight out there. Some are reporting that their profits across railroads have been up, partially due to lower fuel costs. We'll see if that gets passed along. And Lee, I'm going to start with you here on the railroads part. I think you recently had one of the railroad executives on your podcast, so really had a chance to take a deep dive, lift the hood up, and take a deep dive of what's going on in the railroad industry, huh?
Yeah, we had Ed Elkins on. He's Norfolk Southern's CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Commercial Officer. So that was an interesting conversation that I would recommend people to go back and take a listen to. The rails are an interesting story. It's a great business because they're duopolies. There's two in the west, two in the east, and a bunch that kind of compete going north south along the Mississippi. And then there's a new railroad from following an acquisition between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, CPKC, which connects Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, which is a pretty exciting transaction, and I think it could have a lot of positive impact, not only for that in particular railroad, but shippers as well, because I think that deal is actually going to increase or has increased competition amongst the railroads, that north-south going around. For the rails, it's really about volume. A lot of it's out of their control. They can go out and try to win new business, but getting that business onto their network through industrial development can take, years for it to happen. I'm sure we're going to talk about nearshoring and, the stuff that's coming into Mexico. Somebody might be like, yeah, we got to de-risk from China. Let's come to Mexico. It's not like just turning on a light switch. It can take years until freight actually starts moving in and out of a new facility that's planned. But those are all net positives. What the rails can do is really focus on their operations. A more fluid, safer network is a more profitable network. And so that's what the rails are really focused on. And all of them now really truly embrace precision scheduling railroading, which is kind of like Six Sigma for the rails. It's really about continuous improvement and just sweating your assets, which makes economic sense. But they're dealing with a changing labor market like everyone else is, where people would like to a better work-life balance. Railroading is like any other job in transportation. You're out there in the elements, and it can be very challenging. And for some people, they may not be home every night. They're kind of trying to figure that out with better work-life balances for their employees, which I think they've made inroads in undoing. The rails, one of the really good news is for them because they are a duopoly, if you will. They do have pricing power, so they're able to kind of offset or mitigate or fully offset the pressures from inflation, which is everyone knows has been pretty high over the last couple of years. It's been moderating, but inflation could tick up again depending where tariffs take us. So I think the rails are in a good position. I think it's going to be, broadly speaking, I think it's going to be a mixed story. CSX reported yesterday at time of recording this, and they were dealing with some specific company-specific issues that are going to weigh on their earnings growth, where Union Pacific probably painted a much more optimistic outlook for them in 2025.
A lot of moving pieces there. And I love that precision railroading. Lean Six Sigma for the railroads. I love that, Lee. Brian, back to railroads. Now that Lee's kind of shared some of the trends that's impacting 2025 and beyond, your thoughts?
Yeah, so they're obviously the most preferred routing to get to the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, Midwest, and Ohio Valley, right? When moving freight inward from the coast. Items that we've been dealing with this year is just the longer dwell times. So you had the issues with the East Coast and Gulf where people or importers are routing freight through the West Coast. As a result of that, there's been a lot of freight coming to the West Coast, and the dwell times moving from the port to the rail and getting on the rail to the Midwest points has been extended quite a bit. Dwell times have reached as high as 15 days or even beyond that, but the average I think has been about 10 for the dwell times in LA, but they are getting better, which is great. And then to Lee's point around the north south, it's, as we ship in and out of Mexico, it ebbs and flows in terms of how people want to move it. For us, if you put it on the rail, when there are times that there's uncertainty or around the safety of the cargo, the rail is a better option, right? Because it's harder to stop a train than it is a truck moving across the border. But
It is.
Hey, Scott, can I just
Please.
add one thing? Because I have some numbers in front of me, and I'm a numbers guy, so I want to tell some numbers. So in 2023, earnings per share for the rail industry were down around 5%. In 2024, they're pretty much flat. And in 2025, consensus is expecting them to increase 12%. So from an earnings perspective, 2025 is going to be a much better year than the last 2 years.
Love that. Lee, anytime you got veto authority here, anytime you want to inject another data fueled point, you just let us know. I love that. Good stuff there, Lee Klaskow. Let's get into truckload and less than truckload. So the American Trucking Association say that after a couple of tough years, truck volumes are projected to grow here in the U.S. in 2025. Some of those green shoots that Lee was talking about earlier. Lee, why don't you lead off again in the truckload and LTL space?
Yeah, so looking at GDP demand, so GDP is expected to be about 2.8% in 2024 because we don't have the final readings yet, and in 2025 that is expected to moderate to around 2.2%. And industrial production is expected to be positive, albeit at only 1%. It was down last year. So net, we're going to see some growth. The growth might be lower than we saw in 2024. The big unknown really is going to be, Trump's policies. They're obviously protectionist, but they're going to be pro-business, and that could have a positive impact on GDP. In addition to some of the headwinds that it might create. Again, to talk about numbers, LTL carriers are expected to generate around 4% more revenue this year, and earnings per share are expected to increase 17%. When you look at the truckload carriers, that's the earnings growth is expected to be a little more explosive, and that is just because they've had 2 really tough years. Earnings growth could be up around 55% for the truckload carriers. So, and a lot of that's going to be driven by not only more loads, but also what price they're getting for that load. So, as we mentioned earlier, the truckload spot market has been extremely weak and loose. We're seeing a tightening. It's been a slow tightening. It's been like watching paint dry, but it seems like that's accelerating. Knight Swift this week reported their earnings. They had some constructive comments about where they're seeing contractual rates. They're seeing contractual rates. They were expecting them to start increasing by low single digits and maybe to mid single digits throughout the year. They kind of indicated that transition might have happened a little earlier. So that's really good news for trucking, which a lot of folks that are operating the spot market have not been operating at an economic profit.
Yeah. Man, a lot of good stuff there. Lee, we need a whole podcast series on just your last response. And you mentioned, of course, just like Jordan was asking about tariffs, and Lee was kind of talking about some of the uncertainty with what the new Trump administration is going to actually do. But in pre-show, Brian, as I come to you, I'll tell you, it was fascinating TV to watch President Trump sign those executive orders while taking, questions from the press. It was, whether you like him or you don't like him, it was fascinating to watch. But as we were talking pre-show, he was talking about 25% tariffs on our friends in Mexico and in Canada. Whether or not he does it, everyone's discussing it. I would argue if he really was planned on putting 25% on both of those countries, that he'd be touting 35 or 40% across social and all the stump speeches. But who knows? We'll see. Brian, weigh in on what we're seeing in the truckload and the LTL market, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Lee had, that it was a really tough 2 years, right, in the previous 2 years, but everything is moving in the right trajectory for them. It's been a tough 2 years, but I think where everything is going, demand should pick up. Fuel prices, from what Trump's administration is wanting to do, should come down, so it should help the trucking industry from a profitability standpoint.
So on the LTL side, the less than truckload side, I didn't really talk about that much. The ISM index is a really good barometer for LTL demand. That's been negative or contraction territory for 25 of the last 26 months. So that's been a net negative. The good news is that there's an ISM orders index, and that's been positive over the last 2 months. And that tends to be a leading indicator to the ISM index by a lag of 2 months. So you could start to see that ISM number move up and past 50, which would indicate that it is an expanding market. And like I said earlier, industrial production is expected to be positive next year. Roughly speaking, around 75% of LTL freight is tied to industrial or manufacturing sectors, while the rest is retail consumer.
Mm. And the ISM folks that Lee is referencing, the Institute of Supply Management, if they or their PMIs are new on your radar, excellent, regular, monthly, for the most part, sources of data-driven information. And nothing is the single source of truth when it comes to kind of get a sense of where industry and different sectors are performing. But check out, especially their PMI, their what's that? The Procurement Managers Index, Lee, I think was what PMI stands for. But regardless, folks, check it out. It's a great source of information. All right. So where we're going next, Lee and Brian, now that we've gotten a great lay of the land across air, ocean, railroad, and truckload and LTL, I'd love to pick y'all's brain around those shippers that tend to be better than the rest at optimizing transportation and logistics performance, and how they're preparing or have been responding to the uncertainties in the markets the last couple of years, or how they're preparing to engage in 2025 to optimize performance. Any common threads there you're seeing amongst, again, the folks that make it happen better than the rest? And I'm going to flip the script here. I'm going to start with Brian here, and then we'll circle around to Lee. Brian, what are you seeing as supply chain leaders get ready for 2025, both in welcome and not so welcome trends and market environments?
Yeah, I mean, the people that I see that are doing it better are the ones that are nimble, right? In terms of making sure that they're not moving according to the status quo and how they've always done it, but looking at other opportunities for where they need to move freight to and how they want to route freight in and out of the US to where they're sourcing their goods. So obviously it's going to be key that they're going to be able to be nimble this year. Because there's going to be a lot of uncertainty as Trump comes down, starts bringing down the tariffs in different countries, and understanding how that's going to impact their supply chains. And on top of that, a lot of people we work with, to the point that we discussed earlier, we have a lot of front loading on freight, because if importers and shippers can get product landed in the U.S. prior to a stated new tariff on a certain future date, then people are going to do everything that they can to do that. And looking at what they can do to balance their holding costs, warehousing costs relative to what the potential could be for a 20% or a 30% increase in tariff. It's a lot of, you're putting together a hypothesis around what is going to be the best for your business, but a lot of the people that we're working with don't want to take that risk. So they would rather land product here sooner, faster, before any tariff takes effect or any potential tariff takes effect.
Good stuff there. So I have to agree with Garrett. Brian, you do sound really smart. Folks need to reach out with you as they look at those long equations in this crazy environment. Lee, same question. What are you seeing in terms of those best of breed shippers and how they're moving through 2025?
Well, when you asked the question, I wrote down my answer on my scrap piece of paper here, and it's exactly what Brian said, nimble. I wrote down nimble. So I'm in total agreement. I think shippers obviously just have to be mindful of, just bringing too much stuff and having to work through, bloated inventories, which, increases their costs and also is a net negative for the freight markets because it will limit demand. We saw that destocking of inventories happen last year, and that was really a big headwind for the freight markets, especially for truckers and intermodal.
Yeah, good stuff there. Nimble is a great word. It's been a great word for a couple of years, and it'll be in 2025 will be another banner year for those organizations that can truly optimize their anti-fragility and find their is it nimbility? I might be making up a word here, Lee and Brian. We'll see. A lot of good stuff, Brian and Lee. We're going to have y'all back. As promised, Lee, the 1-2 punch. I forgot who's the uppercut and who's the jab, but y'all make quite a tandem. Let's do this. Fast and furious finish. And here's a little surprise question. And Lee and Brian, I'm not sure if you can let anything under wrap, but two-parter. How can folks connect with you, each of y'all? And Lee, we're going to start with you. And second of the two-parter, is there a sneak peek podcast you're about to release or a guest you're about to interview that you might can tease and give folks even more reason to go check out the podcast? Lee?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with folks. Again, if you're interested in getting the Logistics Lead lowdown, just message me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I'm on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, at Logistics Lead. In terms of future podcasts, actually, I don't even know if I can tell you what's on the future from compliance reasons. So I'm not even going to cross that bridge. But, we have a slew of great guests. They're C-suite executives. They're industry regulators, they're industry trade group executives, they're shippers, anyone. I love doing it. And the reason why I love doing it is because I learn so much, and hopefully those that tune in can learn as well.
I'm telling you, good stuff. I'm on the latest Logistics Lead lowdown. You've got like the last 10 episodes, and it's like a who's who of who's moving mountains out there in global supply chain. So folks, check it out. And if you haven't subscribed to the Logistics Lead lowdown, reach out. We'll make sure we make that connection. But Brian, love what the Vector team does in so many different ways. Big supporters of causes and initiatives and nonprofits. Brian, I think the U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently acknowledged a lot of y'all's work in helping those in need out there, and I really admire that. So two-part question for you two. How can folks connect with you and the Vector team, and anything you can tease around what's coming up on Logistics with Purpose?
Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, obviously I live and breathe freight, so I love to talk about it. So if anybody has any questions, thoughts, comments, feel free to email me at brian.oxley@vectorgl.com. Happy to engage and have these discussions. So it's what we do, and it's fun. Now, when it comes to Logistics with Purpose, Vector Global is a B Corp certified company, and we have a bunch of exciting B Corp partners that we work with that will be coming on the show over the next month.
Outstanding. Now, one of my favorites of all time, and I'm disappointed I wasn't invited for the conversation because I'm a big old space nerd, is the gang interviewed an astronaut, and her name escapes me right now, but it was fascinating. So folks, check out both Talking Transports and Logistics with Purpose. You'll be glad you did. Add that to your podcast listening routine each and every week. Logistics Lee Klaskow, Senior Analyst for Transportation and Logistics at Bloomberg Intelligence, host of the popular podcast Talking Transports. Lee, thanks again for being here with us.
My pleasure.
Hope to see you soon. And Brian Oxley, co-founder and managing director of Vector Global Logistics. Brian, it's been a pleasure. Look forward to seeing you in Atlanta soon.
Thank you very much, and definitely looking forward to seeing you.
You bet. Okay, folks, Lee and Brian brought it. Try to say that 7 times fast here today, right? Tons of been there, done that, and data-driven perspective over the last hour. But here's your homework. You've got to take one thing that Lee or Brian shared and put it in action, share it with your team. It's all about deeds, not words, right? As we navigate what I'm hoping will be a year full of plenty of green shoots and then some. But whatever you do, folks, on behalf of the entire team here at Supply Chain Now, Scott Luton challenging you to do good, give forward, be the change that's needed. And we'll see you next time right back here at Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for being a part of our Supply Chain Now community. Check out all of our programming at supplychainnow.com and make sure you subscribe to Supply Chain Now anywhere you listen to podcasts. And follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time on Supply Chain Now.